Hello, everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to go over the big picture of what Orton Gillingham is, the four principles, multisensory techniques, and I'll give you a sneak peek into what a typical Orton Gillingham template looks like. This little wordle is just sort of a way to illustrate all the terminology that you might hear floating around out there in the world of Orton Gillingham and structured literacy. There are lots of programs that are based on Orton Gillingham principles, some commercial programs that you can actually buy, things like Wilson, Project Read, Slingerland, Lively Letters, and even the Linda Moon Bell LIPS program, although it's not Orton Gillingham based, some of the principles are similar. So in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on Orton Gillingham, which is sort of the mothership of all of these multisensory, structured, explicit approaches to teaching reading and spelling. But your school might have something that claims to be Orton Gillingham based, and this presentation will help you understand what the basis of it is. So I'm curious to know if your school uses an OG based program, or if you've trained anything like that, or forgetting the words Orton, OG based or Orton Gillingham, how does your school approach teaching reading and spelling, whether it's in the classroom or in the like in a pull-out intervention kind of session with a reading teacher or sped teacher? Obviously, you can't communicate with me through this YouTube recording, but that would be something I would love to hear on our discussion board or in your posts, because I want you to be taking your school context, the materials that you have, and think about how it matches up to what we know about scientifically based reading research, and if those tools that you have at your fingertips are useful to you as you try to teach in a structured way to your students. So now let's go back in history here. The Shaywitz book that you're reading for this course might cover a little bit of this, but I want to make sure you understand why Orton Gillingham is so important and where it came from. So let's think back to about 100 years ago, before we had technology to examine brain functioning, like MRIs and fMRIs. Psychology and neurology, those were sort of new fields back then 100 years ago. And there's a lot of growth to be made, obviously, in those fields. So some of the psychologists at this time were using the experimental method to identify that there are mental processes involved in reading. Meanwhile, neurologists were examining brain function and behavior of those who lost language function before death. So what this means is they don't have any actual tools to look at the brain, but neurologists at the time were sort of seeing a before and after situation with an adult or a child who was fully functioning, had a brain injury, and lost language function. They could do an autopsy after their death and look at the part of the brain that was damaged or different than a typical brain. And the psychologists, though, educational psychologists, were also sort of seeing how it wasn't necessarily a behavioral thing, why some students were struggling to read, but we're starting to think that it was more connected to this mental process that was going on. So the conclusion at the time was that some learning difficulties in children are related to differences in the brain. So we knew this 100 years ago, that there are neurological differences that make learning hard for some people. They used to call it word blindness at some point too, because they thought maybe it was a visual thing, but through psychology and neurology, that's where it started to become less of a visual impairment, and they realized, okay, this is a difference in brain function. Now, the good news is, and they realized this 100 years ago, and it's still valid today, that even though students who struggle with reading and spelling have a neurological difference, their brain functions slightly differently, and it takes a different route to do the task, we can use educational methods to retrain the brain. So it's worth it for us to understand those best practices that support these students and alleviate their difficulties. So we have some specific contributions there to note. And you'll see in your Shaywitz book, you'll see the Brockes area and their, I don't know how to say that, Wernicke area. And Orton was one of, so Broca and Wernicke were people to discover that those regions of the brain were connected to certain things like speech and phonology. And Orton, Samuel Orton of Orton Gillingham, was a scientist who started to connect that idea to reading and what that means. And on the next slide, we'll get a little bit more into who Gillingham is. So down the road, though, we see all these contributions from Gillingham, Stillman, Monroe, Fernald, Slingerland, the Scottish Rite, that would be the Masons, and Wilson, as in Barbara Mason. All of these people, they, over the past 100 years, trace their training and expertise back to Orton and the Orton-Gillingham method, which is pretty cool. So we actually, what we're talking about, the Orton-Gillingham method, is about 100 years old. It worked then, before we had the science to prove it, and it works now, and now that we even have the science to prove it. So Dr. Orton, about 100 years ago, identified 5 different types of learning disabilities. One of those, although he didn't coin the term dyslexia, one of those categories fits the description of what we now call dyslexia. So he was making inferences, again, because he didn't actually have fMRI imaging, but he was making inferences about children's, the differences in their language ability, and I don't mean spoken language, I just mean all language, written language, their output on paper and everything. So Gillingham was an educational psychologist who worked alongside Dr. Orton, and she's the one who kind of organized his ideas into teaching methods. So she was not necessarily remediating too many students herself, but helped kind of develop the practical end of things. And something that's important is that she expected teachers to have a rationale for their instructional choices. So rather than just do the next thing in the curriculum or just do the next thing on your to-do list or what feels fun for you or the student, she wanted teachers to have a rationale. So that's sort of that diagnostic and prescriptive approach. Like, you look at your student, you understand their weaknesses, and that leads you to make your next instructional choice. Likewise, Stillman was an master teacher. So she is now bringing this to the teaching level, and she actually trained people in these Orton-Gillingham techniques and had the idea of planning the next lesson while you're tutoring. So that's something that's an idea that a lot of us engage in. It's that, again, the diagnostic and prescriptive piece. While we're working with students, we're noticing how they're responding, and we're taking notes, and we're planning what to do next. So in your tutoring sessions or in the lessons that you're doing for this course, that it's expected that you take on this clinical mindset. You already are a responsive teacher. I mean, most of you teach a classroom of students. Some of you are special ed or a reading specialist or Title I, and you work more in small groups or one-on-one, but you all are in front of children in some capacity and are used to seeing how they respond and then making sense of it for the next day. But that, if we can even bump that up to like be marking the individual words that they got wrong, noticing like the discrete little errors that they're making and seeing if we can make sense of that. Now, you don't have to do that for all 25 children in your classroom, but the ones who struggle the most, the ones who have abysmal spelling, they require that from us. They require that kind of deep clinical problem solving, and we can teach ourselves to do that. So here's your goal for the class: to attempt to infuse your spelling instruction with the elements of an Orton-Gillingham lesson plan. Now, I'm not training you in Orton-Gillingham, so it's kind of hard to infuse your lessons with it if you don't really know what it is. But let's just think big picture about the principles of it and less about the itty-bitty nitty-gritty stuff that you'll find in an OG lesson plan. First and foremost, Orton-Gillingham emphasizes the structure of language. that might sound meaningless. But if you think about a lot of what we do in the classroom and a lot of what you find in balanced literacy, we're not emphasizing the structure of language. We're really more focused on the holistic piece of it, like the end product, the process of it all. Reading the book, thinking about the book, planning your ideas for writing, all of that, which is all lovely and important. But before children can make use of that writer's workshop time, before they can make use of that reader's workshop time, they have to be able to read and spell, and to do it with relative ease so that they can engage in the higher order thinking that we want them to do during workshop. So balanced literacy, readers and writers workshop, that's a lovely thing if you are at or above grade level with reading and writing. And we know, or really I have to say mostly above grade level, because even some of those at grade level children, they require the structure of language to be laid out for them so that they can continue to grow. So what is the structure of language? Well, when we're talking about spelling, just like we're talking about for this course, we're thinking about phonology, the sounds of language. We have 44 sounds in English language. The way those sounds are connected to each other and strung together, the way those sounds feel in our mouth, how we produce them. And then we get into orthography, the letter or letters or symbols that match those sounds. And it's not basic in English because we don't have that one-to-one correspondence. It goes way beyond that. We have IGH, that makes the I sound. We have EIGH, that makes the A sound. So the structure of our language is very complex. That's the orthography. Then we also have morphology on top of that. That's this concept of prefixes and suffixes and roots. And you might think, oh, that's just for the big kids, but it's not. It's even for our littlest children who are learning to put ing and s on the end of words. That's morphology. And for our big kids, we kind of leave them hanging and we just sort of assume that they'll put it all together with ride reading, and they'll make sense of how do we spell shun at the end of a word. That's all, when I mention all these things, that's all the structure of language. That's what we need to be explicit about with our students. Whew, that was just the first bullet point. Next is direct instruction. We can't assume that our children will absorb the structure of language, so we have to teach it to them directly. That doesn't mean we stand in front of them and lecture them for 30 minutes at a time. We're talking about small doses. All the little incremental steps of language that we're introducing to them, we will teach them directly. We won't count on them to piece it together on their own. We'll make sure that we're explaining it directly, whether that's doing something color-coded on a whiteboard, showing the base word and suffix, in 2 different colors. It could be using something multisensory to show them how we physically break the word into syllables by breaking apart the blocks. We're directly teaching and showing them. Now, of course, we have the direct instruction piece, that's critical, but it's not all teacher-based. We want our students to be deeply involved. So instead of us just showing them how to do everything, we let them touch and handle the materials and the words and be deeply involved. In fact, our direct instruction might not just be us telling them, but it might be us asking very pointed and pre-thought out questions so that they sort of discover the concept themselves. And that's something that I'll get into in some future presentations, this idea of the discovery method, which is actually a very well-disguised direct teaching, because we're the ones who are curating this little discovery for them. You'll hear the words diagnostic, structured, systematic, sequential, cumulative, simultaneous association of the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. That's the multisensory piece. So this approach, this isn't something you can buy because it's something you have to do. So there are lots of commercial programs that have packaged this nicely for teachers, like Wilson, Project Read, and those are at Fundations, which is the classroom version of Wilson. Those are handy because they have materials and they have a guide and a scope and sequence, and it's easier to use in a classroom than just this open-ended approach, which requires so much from teachers. So whether or not you decide to pursue Orton-Gillingham training or not, these ideas, these connect and are true for all of us. Teachers should be experts in the content that they're teaching and certainly the techniques that they use. The content that we're talking about for this course is the English language, because when we talk about spelling, you have to be an expert at what it is that you want kids to spell. You have to understand it deeply. Not just be a competent speller, but you have to understand what English is and how it's set up. And of course, you have to be an expert in the techniques used to be able to teach English spelling to children. Now, that's not all, because we have our students as well. And some of our students are going to pick up on this fine, some medium, and others are going to struggle a great deal. So using our content knowledge and our knowledge of practice, we also have to pay attention to how our students are responding and see if we need to bend our instruction one way or another. Don't rely on prepackaged or gimmicky things. If you can buy a bundle of something on Teacher Pay Teachers for $50, I don't know if that's going to change lives in your classroom. What's going to change lives in your classroom is your growing expertise in how you respond to kids. And then you can choose some very basic tools to use when teaching the kids. Multisensory techniques are key. And if that's something new to you, we're going to be exploring that in a little bit in this class as well. And then in a minute, we're going to go through these 4 Orton-Gillingham principles that will guide teachers. Again, this is what I want you to be thinking about for this course. Big picture, what are you doing when you're teaching spelling? How can you improve yourself because your school uses this curriculum or that or whatever, or they have nothing for spelling? What are you going to do about it with the materials that you have? So this is the first principle that we're going to unpack. It's this idea of moving from the known to the unknown. Now, again, it might not seem that dramatic to you as teachers, but for our struggling students, it's absolutely critical that we don't overlook this principle. This means we build prior knowledge before introducing a new concept. So if we are going to talk about digraphs with a student, and they've never seen a digraph before, we might first talk about consonants and vowels and the differences between those two kinds of sounds, and then build on it. Well, we're going to learn something new today. Let's figure out if it's a new consonant sound or a new vowel sound. So then let's say you talk about SH that day. The next day when you go to do your TH lesson, you're going to review what is a digraph, what did we learn, and that concept. Might not sound like rocket science. It's probably built into what you do in your classrooms. Now, an Orton-Gillingham lesson is very, very controlled. The idea is that you only include letters, sounds, rules, concepts, whatever, that you have already taught within your Orton-Gillingham time with the student. So who cares what they learned about in their classroom? We can't guarantee that they learned it or got anything out of it. In Orton-Gillingham, you're starting back at square one or wherever you assess them. You're starting at that spot where you found they hit their ceiling. And the only content you include for reading and spelling and activities is the content that you've taught or they've proven to have mastered. Now that's very different than the way a classroom works, because a classroom is kind of all over the place, especially when you're doing guided reading. Those books are not controlled to only include patterns that a child has seen before. They're just sort of a variety of, low level or mid-level words, depending on what guided reading level you're working with. And it could be the same for spelling even as well. When you're using an Orton-Gillingham approach to spelling, you're assuming that this is hard for the student, and so you're going to make the student successful by doing very carefully curated incremental steps. So when you're tutoring this summer, only have them spell things that you've directly taught. Don't just have them spell and practice spelling a bunch of whole random words and think, well, they were in 3rd grade last year, so certainly they learned it. Well, we can't guarantee that, and probably on their assessment with you, it shows that they did not. So only hold them accountable for the material that you've taught them directly. The second principle is moving from simple to complex. And again, this might not sound like rocket science, right? This is sort of the idea of what all schooling goes through. We start with the simple and we move to the complex. With our struggling students, our struggling spellers, take that concept and kind of put it on steroids, because these children are going to be so sensitive to the complexities of the English language that you're going to need to be controlled in how you present things. So when you're making choices for your lesson plans for this course, that's certainly a consideration you have to make. You are only working with them for a few lessons in this course, and you're going to need to think very carefully about how you're going to build those 3 lessons so they link on each other. A good scope and sequence in a commercial program should naturally do this for you. It should already have it planned out, simple to complex. You'll notice most first grade programs, probably the first couple of sounds they review at the beginning of the year when they're teaching kids to read and spell would be things like M, S, A, ah. Those sounds are easy for students to articulate and differentiate between. Something like X, W, Y, X, W, Y. Those sounds are tricky for kids to make because your mouth isn't in that position. So when you say X, that doesn't make the X sound right at the beginning. And W doesn't make the W sound, you know, when a child's mouth is doing it. So that concept can be kind of complex to our struggling students. So that's for the little kids. For the older kids, we might think about the different syllable types that we have them working with. Students can certainly read syllable types before they might be able to understand that concept of syllable type. So we have to, we wouldn't start like those abstract ideas, we wouldn't go right towards them. Even though our little first and second graders are reading all these syllable types, they might not be able to talk about them in those terms. Likewise, for the big kids, when you're doing morphology with them, it helps to talk about prefixes, suffixes, or roots that have really obvious meanings to them. They might be able to read the word instruction, but it's pretty complex to talk about what in, struck, and shun all mean separately. So you wouldn't want to necessarily start with roots that are over their head. You want to break it down and do something like more basic, like submarine. That is a little bit more literal because they probably have some knowledge of sub, and you can talk about a subway, sub-zero, that idea of things being below. That's a simple idea. That's pretty basic. And marine, they might know that word from marina and having to do with water and beneath the water. That meaning makes more sense to them, as opposed to something like instruction, that's a little bit harder to break apart. So when you're planning your lessons this summer, definitely, you might not even get to the complex because you're only doing a few lessons. So think about how to build building blocks to work your way up towards those complex ideas and skills. The third Orton-Gillingham principle is frequent to infrequent. And I think about this one in 2 ways. One, it means begin teaching the most frequent sounds, spellings, and rules first. So in first grade, we're teaching things like AI, not necessarily EIGH, because AI is a very common vowel team. EIGH is not as frequent. Not to mention, it's also very complex. Those 4 letters make one sound, and we don't even see the letter A in those sounds. So again, a good scope and sequence should map that out for you already. Likewise, the vowel team EI, that says A, like in the word vein, or rein, like for horses. You wouldn't teach that very early on either because it's infrequent and it's not as important for reading and spelling. So we want to get the most bang for our buck and teach the most frequent things and dependable things first. We want our students to buy into this idea that English is predictable and there's a code. It just happens it's a very, very complex code, but if we show them the more frequent spellings and rules, then hopefully they'll buy into it and depend on the system. Okay, another way to think about this principle is to think about how we're going to repeat things frequently and then gradually move them to the back burner. So new concepts will be anchored and reviewed daily and frequently, and then it becomes less and less frequent, and we cycle them to, as other things come forward and require more practice, we move those older review concepts backwards a little bit. Lastly, we have the 4th principle of going from the concrete to the abstract. Now, again, the scope and sequence should sort of take care of this for you. Your beginning, our beginning spelling is more one-to-one correspondence. You know, each letter makes one sound and so on. So things like bat, at, that's very concrete. You see a letter, it makes a sound, boom. Then we get into things a little more abstract, like this idea of vowel teams. You know, we have a couple letters that make a sound, or that silent E at the end of words. Then we get even more abstract. We talk about syllable types and the big patterns that we find in our English words, and then the 5 spelling rules, and then morphology, and we move upwards through the grades. Hopefully your scope and sequence at school takes care of that, but we know that a lot of schools cut spelling too early and don't continue that instruction with kids through the end of elementary school or middle school. So it's likely that yeah, they don't have this all mapped out in the curriculum. Now, another way to think about the concrete to the abstract is when you're thinking about teaching something for the first time, a new concept, you'd want to activate it with a concrete experience. So flashcards, those little reading rod blocks that I showed you in class, anything that they can physically hold and touch that allows them to see the syllable type, to make the change for the spelling rule. If things are color-coded, if things are symbolized with manipulatives, that's a way to take something that's abstract and bring it down to the concrete level. If you teach them a spelling rule on the whiteboard and then make them practice it immediately, you're just lecturing them. That's just direct instruction that's missing this link between the concrete to abstract, that's missing that student-teacher interaction piece. And your students, maybe a very savvy student who's very strong linguistically will just get the rule and apply it. But a lot of our kids, particularly our struggling students, are going to need us to build up to the point where we can just dictate a word and they can spell it right away. So we do this by having them touch it, hold it, feel it, manipulate it, etc. So speaking of multisensory techniques, what are they and what aren't they? So in this slide, I'm going to show you, go through some common misconceptions about what multisensory techniques are. It's not just a student tracing in a rice tray or on sandpaper quietly. It's not just any old activity that gets kids up and moving. They're not just for fun. They're very critical in learning. They're not the same for everyone. Children will have different preferences or they'll respond differently to certain methods. And they're definitely not to be ignored or overlooked as you're planning your spelling and reading lessons. Multisensory techniques are essential to building compensatory pathways. So we know in your, oh, I'm sorry, I've been talking about this Overcoming Dyslexia book, the Shaywitz book. You're not required to read that for this class. But in the Motes book, it might talk about that our students are not, our struggling students are not necessarily using the most effective pathways in their brain for reading and spelling. So if you can kind of think of yourself as a teacher and you need to rewire this brain and you need to help them use the most efficient methods to read and spell. So when you go in a woods for the first time, it's all overgrown. But when you keep walking the same way over and over, you're beating down that path and it becomes easier and easier. And you're more likely to choose that route because the other route is more cumbersome and slower, right? Our students, it's not a matter of choice. If they're struggling with spelling because of dyslexia, they can't choose to do things differently, but we can help sort of rewire the brain through very thoughtful instruction. So when you see kids tracing in rice and they're doing something tactile, they're looking at it, that's visual, and they're speaking out loud, that's auditory, that does become multisensory. B, bat, b, B, bat, b. They're making a link between a symbol and a sound. It's arbitrary why we use the letters and sounds that we do. So we have to be really explicit in teaching most of our students so that those links become second nature to them. The best multisensory techniques are simple, yet very powerful. We're not talking about very complicated things. We're talking about if it's an index card, you're cutting it in half with scissors to feel the two parts. You're looking in a mirror to see the shape that your mouth makes. You are tracing something in sand and looking at the shape and saying the sound. You are clicking together different blocks to spell a word. You are tapping on chips to break apart a word into its individual sounds. Simple stuff. These are not expensive things you need to buy. It's more about you understanding, whoa, how can I use the senses to make this complex language system more manageable for my kids? And you got to repeat them over and over because it's like we're beating down that pathway in the woods. So we don't just do it once and think, magic, it's done. They traced the letter in rice. Now they know it. No, we have to work hard to build that pathway. Sometimes you'll see students relying on these techniques. They'll sound tap or whisper to themselves. They'll feel something in their mouth and be in tune to it. So we want to train them to rely on these techniques because they're useful and they work. Now, different students will connect with different techniques, and so that's you as a diagnostic and prescriptive teacher. You'll want to notice those differences in your students and see what kind of works for them. And the key is it has to be simultaneously association of those things. So it can't just be visual. It can't just be auditory. It can't just be tactile. You're linking two or more of them. So if it's color-coded note cards and they're tapping underneath, that's tactile because they're tapping with their fingertip. It's visual because they see the different color code of the vowels and the consonants, and they also see that it's one card per phoneme. And it's auditory because they're saying the sounds as they go. So something so simple like that is actually very powerful. And it's not just this, but you have to use them the right way. If you're just flashing cards in front of kids, that's not multisensory. So it's more of a shift in our brains as teachers to think to understand how we can shift our teaching and tweak it just a little bit. So now let's think about an actual Orton-Gillingham lesson. There are some multisensory routines built right in. If you are not interested in learning about the lesson plan, I'm going to have you skip to the next slide. But if you are, let me tell you. So the phonogram and blending drill, that's when you're using those color-coded flashcards. That is multisensory by nature. You're having the student look at the flashcard and say that little memory cue, B, bat, b, ch, chinch, and they're going through them all. You might have them look at their mouth or trace when needed. Then you have the cards set on the table and they're blending the word patterns. They're tapping if they need to. They're dividing it into syllables if they need to. That is the blending drill. That's multisensory just by nature. If they're reading and they sound tap under a word, that's multisensory. When they're spelling and they do the simultaneous oral spelling, SOS, they're sound tapping on their fingers to sound it out before they write it, that's multisensory. And if they're using Wilson magnets or other color-coded letter tiles, that's multisensory. If you have these materials at your fingertips, try using them for spelling. You might be used to using them for reading. Try bending them towards spelling and try seeing if they would be helpful, not just for those students who really struggle, but if they would be helpful to the majority of your classroom. Even your grade level students would benefit from these techniques. Again, move along if this is too much for you and you're not ready to go this deep with thinking about Orton-Gillingham, but stay on this slide if you're curious. This is an example of an Orton-Gillingham lesson plan. I was trained through the Scottish Rite, so those are the Masons, and they have a huge program across the country where they train teachers in Orton-Gillingham and provide free tutoring for those with dyslexia. This happens to be their template. The essential pieces are there in most Orton-Gillingham templates. You'll see at step 1, we have our phonogram blending drill. Step 2 is a review word list, some sight words in there. Step 3 is where you teach your new concept using the discovery method, and you can see auditory, visual, tactile, kinesthetic. That's that just multi-sensory piece. Step 4 is a new word list where you practice those direct skills right then and there, just very targeted. And step 5 is your reading sentences or a small selection that's decodable. It only includes words that you've just learned or have learned in previous lessons. Step 6 is a phonemic awareness or multisensory practice. This is where I usually do something like Wilson magnets or reading rods or some sort of a sort. Step 7 is 7, 8, and 9 are the 3 spelling steps, and I'm going to go over these directly maybe week 6, I think it is, week 5 or 6. I talk about these specific Orton Gillingham dictations. If you know Wilson or Foundations, it's pretty much the same thing. It's a sound dictation, a word dictation, and a spelling dictation. And those words and sounds and whatever, they're perfectly aligned with everything the student has learned so far. So it's not just this whole general mix-up. It's building on the student's knowledge that they've gained through the OG lessons. Lastly, you put it all together in step 10 with oral reading. For most students in OG, this is a decodable text that is highly predictable and controlled and only includes the information or the concepts they've learned so far with you. Older students might be moving more away to leveled text to try to be incorporating more sight words and more of a mixture of patterns. So that's the big picture of an OG lesson. You are not doing this for this course, but I do want you to see how targeted and structured it could be, and then how could we take those principles and infuse them into our classroom practice. So for our class, you can refer to the Orton Gillingham scope and sequence that I put in your folder at the beginning of class. I think it's on our shared Google Drive as well. Or you can use your classroom scope and sequence. I want you to make use of this class and have it really impact your work in the fall or whatever semester you're taking this. So think about, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to examine your own scope and sequence at school and go deeper and make better use of that by working on improving your instruction and your practice techniques? Or is your school one, can you not count on that? And do you want to use an Orton Gillingham or another scope and sequence and try that out with your classroom? Whatever your choice is, dip your toe in the water this summer with your selected child that you're tutoring, and work on trying to remediate their spelling in a very meaningful way. Take it up, bump it up a notch from what you're used to doing with them. Now, the idea is that you're going to be doing a full spelling lesson, not an Orton Gillingham lesson. And how long, honestly, can you spend on spelling? So you might be doing some reading work with it as well, just to sort of complement it, because our reading and our spelling go together. If you are looking for a scope and sequence that you would to improve, what your school is doing, I do have to say there's not one perfect scope and sequence that we can use for spelling, yet there are very reliable ones. There are ones that are trustworthy. So if you'd like to examine that, that was part of your post for week 2 was to dig deep in your own scope and sequence. But if you would like some feedback on that, I would love to chat with you about it. You can take a picture of it and email or text it to me, and we can kind of go through what we see are the strengths and the weaknesses of your school's program. I'm happy to do that. So in summary, let's think about your teacher content knowledge. What are all the things that you have to know in order to do a good job teaching spelling for your grade level? Well, first of all, you need knowledge of the big picture. Where did my students come from in the years before I'm teaching them? Where are they heading next? You kind of have to know the whole continuum. You also have to have knowledge of phonemic awareness and phonics content. That means how to work with sounds, how the sounds of our language work, and by phonics I mean things like the letters and the digraphs and the vowel teams. You have syllables, prefixes, suffixes. You have to have knowledge of all of that. Basically the English language, right? And you'll have to know the typical progression in general education. So in a classroom, in a general ed classroom, how are things moving? What does it look like? Also, it helps to have knowledge of where children are going to struggle. What are the trickiest things for this grade level or this age, or for a struggling student with or without dyslexia? What are the areas where they're likely to slip up? And then going deeper with content knowledge, the idiosyncrasies of the little sounds, the fact that TH, those letters, can make 2 sounds. And knowing that difference, that's a big deal when you're teaching someone to read and spell. Those 5 spelling rules, all of this stuff, this is complicated stuff, and teachers are not usually fully prepared to have all this content knowledge. But if we're expected to teach kids to spell and read, we have to know the English language in depth. And finally, what we do with that content knowledge is so important. We also have to have knowledge of the particular student or students right in front of us. How do they feel about learning? How do they feel about themselves? What sorts of activities get them excited? Which sorts of activities are effective and get them over that little roadblock that's in their mind? And we have to have knowledge of the techniques to do these things. We don't just want to have the content knowledge. We have to know how to make that come alive for our students. And those are the instructional techniques, the direct instruction, the discovery method, the multisensory techniques, all of that. So we're putting together content knowledge, student knowledge, instructional knowledge. And we can do that, right? Of course we can.